overview about the project and to tell you initially that we're going to record the meeting, partly because we ended up doing it in the middle of July for various reasons, and we know that that probably didn't suit a lot of people because July is traditionally a bit of a holiday time in Northern Ireland. So we are going to use the recording on our website and on the project website, so people who can't get along in person today will be able to listen to it afterwards, which is a really effective use of resources, which we used to not do, but now we do routinely. So it's amazing what we've all learned to do through the pandemic. So thank you all for joining us on this lovely hot day. Julianne, will you move on just 2 slides, please? That would be great. So I think most of you know that I'm Denise Hayward. I'm Chief Executive of Volunteer Now. I just wanted to say that Volunteer Now is thrilled to be part of the project, and we have been working with partners across the UK to look at this research over the last six months now. Volunteer Now, as you know, as many of you know, is a regional support organisation for volunteering across Northern Ireland. And what we wanted to do through this project is to learn from what has happened in volunteering over the last 18 months. I mean, it's clear to those of us who've been actively involved in volunteering that we've seen a massive shift, a change in how people have engaged over the pandemic. So, I mean, initially the narrative was all very much about all these new people who'd stepped forward and the massive outpouring of community spirit. And it's very clear as well that that has sustained many individuals and communities up and down the country over the last 18 months, and it still continues to sustain many people in their everyday lives. We've also now seen a narrative as well about how new groups have formed, new work has started, things that never happened before are now routinely happening, and all sorts of change has taken place. We've also then seen existing groups that have been involved in volunteering for years and years and years, maybe having to postpone or pause their activities, step down their volunteers. So I suppose what I am describing is just the narrative, anecdotal picture that I have heard as Chief Exec in my job, in my day job, and in engaging with our members. So what we wanted to do as part of this project is to think about what actually has happened, what can we learn from that, and what will that help in terms of shaping policy and practice in volunteering going forward in the years ahead. So this was a fantastic opportunity for us to be part of this project. The partners across the UK have been great support. We're delighted to have Irene and Jürgen with us this morning. Irene is the professor who's leading the study from Northumbria University, and it's a thrill to have her with us, and Jürgen also as well today, joining us from the University of East Anglia. Jürgen is Director of the Institute of Volunteering Research. So really pleased to have them both with us today, and we're in very safe hands, I think, through the project this morning. So I suppose just to describe what we've been doing, there's been a policy analysis, which Ewen's going to talk about this morning. There's also been a survey, which we have conducted across Northern Ireland, and Nick's going to say a little bit about that. And also then Laura is going to describe to us what's been actually happening in terms of the research so far, what reports have already been available, and to look at that from a Northern Ireland context. We will then be continuing through the project to do some interviews over the next number of weeks as well with key policy stakeholders as we look through the evidence coming through from the research project. And then we'll be wrapping up with a final report later in the year. Julianne, would you move on to the next slide for me, please? Okay, so this is our overview for this morning. We're aiming to have you out the door with your sandwiches intact for lunch by about 12:15. So I say Laura's going to do an overview about what the existing research has shown. Laura is, I should say, Dr Laura Crawford is a senior research fellow based at Northumbria University. Her PhD was in human geography, and she's overseeing the data collection activities in the project and the project outputs. And without Laura, it's fair to say, I think nothing would get done. So we have to thank her for all of her work behind the scenes as well. Then we're going to be hearing from Dr Ewen Speed, who's the Professor of Medical Sociology in the School of Health and Social Care at the University of Essex. Ewen has been looking at the policy, the public policy aspects of volunteering that have impacted on how each of the 4 nations has responded to the pandemic, and he's going to be talking us through that. And then Dr Nick Acheson, who is the academic lead for Northern Ireland, will be bringing up the rear, looking at the actual survey that we've done in Northern Ireland. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Laura to you to get her started, and she's going to share her screen. So just bear with us a wee minute as she does that.
Thank you, Denise. I think you should be able to see the slides now. Can you see them okay? Wonderful. So thank you for that introduction to the project there, Denise. What I'm going to present today is an overview of what the existing research has told us about voluntary action during the pandemic. This was a crucial step in our process of devising our survey because we realised we couldn't kind of go ahead and create questions until we'd really thoroughly engaged with what the existing research was saying and we'd identified those gaps. So to that effect, we identified over 80 existing research reports on voluntary action during the pandemic from across the UK. These represented volunteer involving and infrastructure organisations and local authorities. These reports take stock of what happened to volunteering during the pandemic and also make recommendations to inform recovery. Much of this existing research was written following the first lockdown, perhaps prematurely reflecting on what recovery would look like. It's also worth acknowledging that many reports claim to be UK-wide, yet few explicitly focus on data from a Northern Ireland perspective. As such, it would be interesting to gauge whether the themes that I'm going to talk through, to what extent they resonate with your experiences. So the first theme that I want to focus on is mutual aid and local activity. This was one of the most remarkable features during the first lockdown was the speed at which communities and hyperlocal groups organised to provide emergency support to members of their community. Many of these early responses gravitated around food and medicine, but in some cases evolved with the pandemic to support families' homeschooling or with wellbeing initiatives like befriending. In many cases, these informal networks were able to respond quicker than formal organisations. Local responses were responsive to local needs and were built on a spirit of mutualism and trust within communities. Another widely reported theme in the existing research was the spirit of collaboration and partnership that was galvanised across sectors and within organisations after the onset of the crisis. Cretu remarked that the crisis was a catalyst for change in local government, where rather than working in silos, multidisciplinary teams were created with staff redeployed to triage calls and respond to requests for help. Bureaucratic processes were streamlined and data sharing helped to quickly identify those in need. Collaboration allowed for flexible responses, recognising that local government actors were not always best placed to respond. In the context of food banks, Cretu noted that many people go directly to food banks because of the stigma of accessing council services and fear of being referred for social care intervention. This spirit of collaboration and partnership was, however, geographically uneven. The MOVE project, which is based in England, introduced 3 models that describe the different ways voluntary action was coordinated at different localities. The first model involved local infrastructure organisations taking a lead role in brokering relationships. In the second, responses were coordinated through a network of local hubs. And in the third, there was a collaborative multi-agency response representing a whole community approach based upon place-based partnerships. The response model adopted was dependent on the strength of existing relationships between statutory services, the voluntary sector and communities, and the size of the area. The degree of collaboration also varied amongst different actors. Of particular interest is the relationship between mutual aid groups and local authorities. In many cases, the local council had served as an invaluable partner and source of expertise, but in other cases, local government were deemed to be getting in the way. For Tiratelli and Care, supportive councils find ways to facilitate without crowding out the community, and the best approach is one that sees community action as important and worthy of support rather than as a source of amateurism and needless challenge. There was a widespread sense that where public services had been investing in new ways of working with communities and the voluntary sector pre-COVID, there was a better response. Similar trends were reported in areas prone to flooding. Social and community-led infrastructure had proven their worth and enabled joined-up responses built on existing relationships. The pandemic also accelerated modernisation, encouraging more agile ways of working and leading to the large-scale digitisation of services. digital technologies and apps were increasingly used to identify pockets of need and mobilise volunteers in response. New approaches to funding for community-led initiatives were also identified, where priorities were determined by communities themselves. Despite these innovations, the pandemic exacerbated and brought into sharper focus pre-existing inequalities, as well as leading to the emergence of new pockets of need. The impact on the voluntary sector was vastly unequal. While going digital provided many with the opportunity to engage with a wider geography, some projects were impossible to imagine in a virtual format. Remote or online volunteering may have enabled those shielding to volunteer from home, but for many, a lack of access or knowledge prevented continued engagement. Moreover, organisations dependent on trade, including social enterprises and charity shops, have been adversely impacted. Across the research, loneliness and social isolation, mental health and digital exclusion were repeatedly cited as the most pressing concerns, with these societal needs likely to play a role in shaping what volunteering opportunities are available in the future. So the next section explores 4 key themes representing hopes, fears and recommendations relevant to recovery. Throughout the studies, there was a sense that in spite of the challenges of the pandemic, there were some innovations that emerged, which if harnessed effectively, could prove beneficial in the future. The first key theme related to recovery is funding and investment. Across the research, there was widespread uncertainty about the future funding landscape, with calls for more flexible funding, supporting core costs as opposed to project costs, to enable organisations to respond more flexibly to future crises, and in many cases, quite simply, to secure their future existence. Resilience was a word repeatedly used to characterise the response, yet resilience does not emerge spontaneously, it requires investment. Consequently, researchers called for investment in community wealth and capacity building, and to allocate budgets for communities to sustain local action. Investing in communities of place is seen as one way to sustain the involvement of those who've helped their community without necessarily identifying as being a volunteer. Secondly, volunteer inclusion and well-being is an emerging theme within our survey findings. The pandemic has prompted a shift in the demographics of the volunteer cohort, enabling and constraining the inclusion of different groups in different ways. Alongside a surge in interest, many long-serving volunteers were forced to stand down and shield. The furlough scheme and increase in home working enabled many to volunteer for the first time. And Tiratelli and Kay found that more working aged people were involved in mutual aid groups than other kinds of voluntary activities. As such, many reports called for renewed attention on employer-supported volunteering to enable working age adults to engage in the future. Moreover, throughout the events that we've hosted over the past couple of weeks, there is an increasing sense that organisations are considering more flexible volunteering offer in the future to help more people to engage, whether that be facilitated through app-based technology or through ad hoc opportunities or roles. Gotts et al. Drew attention to the health and well-being impact on older adults who have been stepped down from their volunteering roles. Organisations are facing challenges striking a balance between supporting volunteers to re-engage without pressuring them to return before they are ready, especially with COVID cases rising considerably. There is increasing recognition that many volunteers have lost confidence and mobility, and for some, the roles they once held may no longer exist. On the whole, there are growing concerns that those who stand to gain the most from volunteering are facing considerable barriers which could undermine previous work to make volunteering more inclusive. The third theme is relationships and partnerships. While there was a noticeable increase in collaborative working over the course of the pandemic, many were concerned that in an uncertain funding landscape, partnership would give way to competition and gatekeeping, as, quote, dealing with money scarcity is hardly a space for innovation. Numerous reports emphasised how the voluntary sector should be included in emergency planning forums at local, regional and national levels. Many called for measures to support future partnership working, and these will be based on an honest assessment of what each stakeholder is best placed to do. For example, many have called for local government actors to undertake an enabling or facilitative approach to support others to take more hands-on roles. The pandemic has also provided an opportunity to look beyond a binary of informal versus formal volunteering. Informal groups have been able to scale up by linking with formal organisations, and formal organisations have gained community intelligence by tailoring responses at the local level. or as a report from Queen's University Belfast in March 21 suggests, rather than reinforcing a rigid distinction between formal and informal approaches, responses to the COVID-19 pandemic have highlighted how, with care and mutual appreciation, formal and informal volunteering can operate along a mutually supportive continuum. Lastly, all reports express concerns about the increasing severity and wide-ranging nature of societal need, which will undoubtedly place increasing pressure on the voluntary sector. Meanwhile, organisations have been encouraged to build back better, with little recognition for the impact on staff, many of whom are burnt out after more than 16 months in crisis response mode. Many organisations are preoccupied with day-to-day activity and don't have the time or space to strategically plan for recovery. As the Relationships Project argue, perhaps we first need time to recuperate and heal before embarking on a process of recovery. And then last slide. Oh no, that was the last slide. I'm going to put that one back on. So this analysis of existing research formed a key component of our research, and as I mentioned before, shaped the design of our 4-nation survey. We identified several critical gaps in the existing knowledge which influenced our survey questions. These included how voluntary action has changed over the course of the pandemic, not just what happened in the first lockdown, and exploring the impact of this on the roles available, the types of people stepping forward, and such like. Also, what learning has been prompted by the pandemic and how this may impact how organisations work in the future. We're hearing from a lot of organisations considering kind of a more blended approach to some of their voluntary programmes going forward, and what support organisations would need from a range of stakeholders through to recovery. So thanks to those of you who completed the survey. We look forward to sharing the results both in this event and in our mid-project briefing report. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Laura. That was really informative. And I think we'll come back to discuss some of the themes that have emerged from that during the breakout discussions towards the end of our session this morning. So Ewen, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you. Are you happy to screen share?
Yeah, I've got the bin lorry just pulled up outside just as you cut to me, so bear with me. That
happened to me before. My cleaning lady started hoovering the room above my head just as I was introducing everybody this morning. So these things happen.
Sorry. Can people see? Is that people seeing PowerPoint there?
Yeah. Can you make it bigger?
Yeah.
That's it. Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Give me 1 second, I'll shut the window. It's a little bit better. Okay, thank you for the invitation this morning. So I'm going to talk about really the issue in this project is really trying to do an analysis that looks across England, Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, and that's quite novel, I think, or brings with it a lot of novelty. And so I'm going to talk about the Northern Ireland sort of preliminary analysis, but really it's in the context of the 4 jurisdictions. And part of the analysis is doing a between case analysis and then a within case analysis. So this is really the within case analysis is looking at each jurisdiction on its own independently, and then the between case analysis is the comparison across the different jurisdictions. So a little bit of flavour of both. But in terms of the sorts of research questions that we're trying to tease out in this, the original research questions that we posed were: in what ways do the voluntary action policy frameworks adopted by the 4 nations in response to COVID-19 differ? And how effective are they? I'm really taking the view that this is about sort of what government policy, what conditions of government policy make possible, what sort of activities and strategies they make possible, and what sort of things they make more difficult. And there's clear differences between what is possible to do in terms of voluntary action in Scotland, say at one end of the scale, and then what is possible to do in terms of voluntary action in terms of England, which I would say the policy analysis is suggesting is at the other end of the scale. So there seems to be much more, well, sort of to prejudge the analysis, but there seems to be much more opportunity for engagement between voluntary actors and government in Scotland than there is in England, for example. And Wales and Northern Ireland tend to be sort of somewhere in between those two positions. So yeah, within the context of the UK, there is the declaration would be some degree of congruence because of the political nation, but there's also some degree of difference. And we can see that most clearly. I think the most clear example is how the NHS works in the different jurisdictions. So that's the sort of rationale. In terms of the methodology, we're using discourse analysis. So discourse analysis is primarily concerned with establishing how specific entities, such as a national government or a regional organisation or a food bank, local residents association, construct or develop their understanding of different processes, different social constructs, different social processes. So I guess an example here would be community. The idea of community as a social process is very abstract. Lots of people will know what community is, but if we actually try and get some coherent agreement across a group of people about what community is, we might find it becomes much more difficult. So whilst everybody has an idea in their heads of what community is, what it actually is in practice differs and varies. And it's the same thing in terms of voluntary action. So efforts to understand what people think about and make sense of in terms of ideas of community volunteering will differ hugely from person to person and from country to country. There are, however, clear inferences that we can use to make sense of community action, how they're shaped by local policy, national policy, political aspects, cultural, economic, so on and so forth. So in order to understand how discourses of community volunteering are constructed, there's a need for the academic analyst, the researcher, to collect relevant documents from specific contexts and to analyse what appear to be the most dominant ways of talking about voluntary action, community, and so on and so forth, and also the least, the more marginalised ways of speaking about specific abstract contexts. So the assumption is that those differences between the countries will be enacted through respective acts of policy and will be played out differently across the different policies that different countries have. So the differences will become evident in the way that the different respective assemblies develop that policy in relation to community volunteering. When I talk about doing discourse analysis, it's very much about a fluid and dynamic process of analysis. The intention is not to arrive at a fixed definition of what Northern Irish voluntary action policy is, what Scottish voluntary action policies, what Welsh voluntary, is to explore those differences and similarities and to talk about the idea of the different conditions of possibility and how these might be playing out across a different policy context. So I just want to go back to an important detail that I omitted was the time frame that we chose for. So we looked historically at the policy strategy framework, and I'll talk about that in a little bit in terms of the initial framework. And then we looked specifically in terms of the COVID response for the period between the 23rd of March and the 22nd of 2020 and the 22nd of March 2021. Now, specifically, those are the dates between the first UK-wide lockdown on the 23rd of March and then the purdah that was implemented for the local elections across the UK on the 22nd of March 2021. So that's the policy framework in which we're looking at. Another difficulty with this project is it's so dynamic, it's so fluid, it's so fast moving, we're still in the middle of it. So in terms of deciding on a specific relevant date for when we might decide that we want to stop looking at policy differences, it becomes really quite difficult and problematic. So yeah, sorry. And then between, I already mentioned the sort of within and between case analysis. So looking at the specific jurisdictions and then looking across for similarities and differences across the different jurisdictions. So the initial framework, which is available in a working paper, which we can send you the link to, it's on the project website, was to look at the most recent policy framework that the different jurisdictions had published through government in terms of voluntary strategy. So England, we're going back to 2012, 2010, sorry, I mean, there have been other stuff since then, but that's the sort of the biggest sort of landmark position that outlines a government position in relation to voluntary action. In Northern Ireland, it goes back to Join In, Get Involved, which is 2012. Wales is a 2015 document, and Scotland has a 2019 document. So taking just a sort of a qualitative analysis software program to analyze these documents and to sort of do a frequency analysis, the sorts of words that are appearing so in these documents. So if you look at these four different analyses of the 4 policy documents, the bigger the word, the more often it appears in the document. And we can see here that there's a clear difference between the England strategy and Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland. There's a clear divergence in terms of how things like social value are regarded within these documents. So the English, the English policy document is essentially the big society document that Cameron published in 2010. And the focus is much more on transactional and with a focus on government and what the relationship between government and the voluntary sector might be. And the voluntary sector is very much set up as being something separate and apart from government. Whereas if we look at the Northern Irish, the Welsh and the Scottish documents, the emphasis seems to be much more about volunteering, about much more collaborative, much more emphasis on mutual benefit, mutual exchange, partnership work, and so on. And then in terms of the sort of, just to conclude, in terms of that preliminary analysis, looking within cases, the Scottish policy response, there's an alignment between the work of what is described in the documents as the third sector and the work of the Scottish government, aligned to already existing in place policy priorities. Very much in terms of the COVID response, building on systems and structures that were already there. And we see that similar in the Welsh case. The Welsh case demonstrates the analysis undertaken to update existing already in place voluntary action strategies. The emphasis is placed on updating what was already there and not so much on issuing guidelines. The contrast with the Scottish case and the Welsh case is quite stark. There's a much clearer alignment between the work of voluntary actors and and government. The focus is on strategy, infrastructure, and aligning COVID response with existing policy priorities. I've put Northern Ireland last because this is a Northern Ireland briefing, so I just wanted to finish on Northern Ireland. But if we look at England, the response was targeted much more around sort of public health guidelines about issues in relation to facilitating voluntary action and how people were able to continue to engage and work in voluntary action in the context of the ongoing pandemic. So my argument would be that this sort of echoes the sort of transactional civil society model of voluntary action that sort of we saw in the analysis in the English policy context. So the argument here would be that in terms of the English policy response, they can't have a strategy for English voluntary action because they've largely said that that isn't a responsibility of government. The government isn't responsible for coordinating and strategizing on voluntary action. It's the voluntary sector, the third sector, is voluntary action is responsible for that. So it's difficult, given the sort of position that the UK stroke English government has taken, for them to have a strategy for voluntary action because they've said they don't see it as a facet of government, or they don't see it as a direct facet of government. So in that context, we can see the guidance that the conditions of possibility in terms of what they were able to say about voluntary action were very much about public health guidance, because they don't see voluntary action as being something that's responsibility of government. And I'd be interested to hear what people here today think, because I think that we see a similar pattern being played out in terms of the Northern Irish context. There isn't the same number of policy documents in relation to voluntary action in the response to COVID as there are for the Scottish and Welsh cases, for example. So I wonder whether we've seen a similar thing here in the political context in Northern Ireland during the pandemic and the lockdown, coupled to a sort of an inability to make active direct policy in relation to voluntary action, means that, again, we've seen a similar pattern to the English case. It's been about guidelines on public health response rather than building on or developing that strategic response in terms of existing policies. And that's all I have to say today.
Okay, thanks, Ewan. We'll pick up that theme actually in the discussion as we go forward this morning. So do you want to share now?
Yeah, there we go.
Great job. That's lovely. Thanks so much. And then now we're handing over to Nick, who's just going to give us a flavour about the research that has taken place already in Northern Ireland. Nick, do you want to screen share? Or
yeah, I'm sorry about this, but this is actually, believe it or not, the very first time I've actually done a presentation on Zoom. I've absolutely no idea how to proceed from this point on. Apologies for my lack of skill in this area, but it's a consequence of retired life. Very happy to be in a situation I'm in, so I'm sorry about this. Either I sent Andrew a copy of my slides last night, so either he could do it, or someone could tell me what to do.
Andrew will do it for you. So
my apologies for that.
Andrew will do that for you. Hang on.
Okay, Andrew, have you got those? Here we are. Make it into a full screen. Thank you very much. Apologies to Laura. I liked her first slide so much that I thought I'd copy it and just put my name at the bottom. So that's really what to say about that. So what I want to do in this presentation very briefly is to bring up what we've tried to do in Northern Ireland, and say a little bit about where the Northern Irish survey fits into the surveys across each of the 4 nations of the UK. Just to remind you, and Laura's already mentioned this, the 3 core questions in the research, and just simply reiterated them here. In what ways, the policy framework question, who is responding to the call to volunteer, has the profile of volunteers changed, and how can we continue the involvement of new volunteers beyond the pandemic? And the 3rd question is about good practice and sharing and transferability of good practice from within the jurisdictions and between each jurisdiction. So those core questions have to be addressed in, Andrew, sorry, can you go back to the previous slide of a sec before I go into this? Those 3 questions were had to be included in each of the surveys, but the surveys that went out in each of the 4 jurisdictions were each a little bit different. In Scotland, it was done in partnership with the Scottish Government because they were already doing a survey on this. So Volunteer Scotland simply is where worked in partnership, very close partnership with them. And again, it reflects what Ewan was saying about how voluntary action in Scotland is very closely aligned with ongoing government policy. And this is reflected in the way the survey was done there. Wales and England were, of course, done separately to government, but the policy context obviously were different there. And in Northern Ireland, the main difference in the survey here was we did not survey volunteer using organisations here, unlike in Scotland, Wales and England. We simply looked at infrastructure organisations, both councils and health trusts, and what we in Northern Ireland call the voluntary and community sector organisations. So our survey is slightly different focus, but and it is also worded a bit differently. Each survey was worded a bit differently, but bear in mind they were all having to cover the core issues, themes across the whole of the UK, so we could develop some kind of comparative analysis, as well as having analysis that are specific to each jurisdiction. So those are the guiding principles behind the design of the survey. So the survey went out, I think, in May. Thank you to everybody who filled it in. Andrew, can you move to the next slide, please? Thank you very much. Now, this is the only result I've got for you today. Can you actually see the right-hand column? Okay, right, Northern Infrastructure Organisation numbers. But basically, this is some geographical spread, the numbers of organisations. This survey is simply, this table simply is the numbers of organisations. But as you can see, we had 99 responses, which is very good. But it means obviously that the percentages are going to be almost identical to the numbers when it comes to calculating percentages. So take it as read that these could be either, basically, but they are actual numbers on this table. So you'll see we had 99 responses. All the councils responded, which is really good. All 11 councils responded. All the health trusts responded. You'll notice there are 7 responses from health trusts, and I guess that's because in a couple of them we got 2 responses rather than just 1. That's not a problem because we're not actually requiring a single institutional view from each health trust, but we're looking at different perspectives. And if trusts have given us slightly richer data in that case, it's not a problem for us. So 7 is there, 7 is good. Local infrastructure organisations, we're particularly pleased at this. 38 of those responded, and I'll say a bit more about the distribution of those in a minute. And Northern Ireland-wide infrastructure organisations, again, a very good turnout there. Now, unfortunately, I can't see the numbers in the right-hand column there. Can anybody else see that they are? Not actually on my screen. So if I actually maybe got rid of the ESPA, so 43 there, brilliant. So geographical spreads, just a couple of things to mention there, that geographical spread, or other, the density of response from different parts of Northern Ireland is probably the best way to put it. There are, this is affected very much by the number of local infrastructure organisations that responded. And I think that if you look at particularly that Derry and Belfast, almost certainly underrepresented here, because each of those only managed to produce, well, in the Belfast case was 2 local infrastructure organisations, and in Derry only 3. So this was that probably brought their numbers down a bit. So I think when it comes to analysis, I think we have to bear in mind the fact that the city areas, more urban areas of Northern Ireland, have been somewhat underrepresented here. And conversely, ABC Council, Armagh, Banbridge, and Craigavon have done excellently well, obviously because Denise lives in that council area. With 8 responsible local infrastructure organisations, which mean that they win that race, and it means that the total of 26 respondents from that council area, which is considerably higher than anywhere else. Newry-Moore and Down District Council of 23 was second, and that was partly because more of the Northern Ireland regional infrastructure organisations came to work in Newry-Moore and Down rather than some of the other council areas. That means that we need to sort of bear those figures in mind. But overall, we're extremely pleased with this survey, with the responses to the survey. It was really excellent. I think we're going to have some really good results coming out of it. Now, the analysis is only just beginning. Number crunching is starting, and for those of you who fill the survey in, remember there are a lot of options, things to fill in, which can be converted into numbers. So we're doing number crunching at the moment to try and work out some of the answers, some of the key questions we asked. So Andrew, can we go into the next slide, please? So the 4 key questions we wanted to do. Can you move slightly over to the right, the thing over to the right, so you can get into the beginning of the sentence. What has changed in who volunteers and what volunteers do? What kinds of activities have been most affected? What do people feel are now the main challenges? And how does our experience in Northern Ireland compare with England, Scotland, and Wales? So those are the 4 key questions in the survey. And next slide. As you will feel, we then looked at how the pattern of volunteering had changed as a result of the pandemic during 3 specific periods. Period of the first lockdown, the easing of restrictions summer and autumn of 2020, and the second lockdown, which is obviously as far as we can go because we're running really until last March when we put the survey together. So you asked to answer the same set of questions for each of those periods in time. I think that's going to produce some very interesting analysis as to how that actually has changed. So looking forward to seeing what the figures look like there. The second really interesting thing we looked at was the different most important roles during the pandemic. Whether new things people were doing, if so, to what extent? Did other volunteering roles fall by the wayside? And how did that relate to the kinds of people who are now volunteering or the kinds of people who are no longer able to volunteer? Third question was, in a sense, how important were volunteers in the overall response to the pandemic? In terms of the public policy response on the whole and the community response as a whole, where does volunteering fit into that bigger picture? And I think that's to get some sense of what people, that's obviously the qualitative judgment, And I'd be interested to analyse what people had to say about that. And the final question was about how has the pandemic affected different kinds of volunteering at different locations which it takes place. Obviously, volunteering takes place around a whole lot of different kinds of areas, from environmental activism to food banks to all kinds of different things. And I think we want to try and to ask people to make a judgment as to how much, what had changed, what had suffered in particular, and what how to what extent was that going to be permanent damage to particular areas of volunteering, to what extent they're likely to recover. So in a sense, it's looking back, but also people looking forward and saying, what does it look like for the future? So it brings the next slide, which is a legacy, in a sense, is what has changed and how organizations work with volunteers. And are these changes likely to be permanent? And what are the main challenges now for volunteering in terms of infrastructure support, policy guidance, and in terms of human resource needs, all those different kinds of things, people, the internal and external things organizations actually need to sustain volunteering into the future. So last slide. So looking to the future, what kinds of support will organizations need in the future? And what have people learned, and on reflection, what might have been done differently, or better or differently? So what lessons are we going to take to the future? And the other thing, I suppose, is which is placed in the survey back into the context of the UK as a whole. Have we done things here or done things in new ways that might be interesting and useful for volunteering practice elsewhere in the UK? And so that will be, as opposed for us to make a judgment in doing the analysis of the survey. But none of this would be possible, of course, without people's spending the time to fill the survey in. And I think we're just really pleased about the level of response there. It's excellent. Given my experience, it actually can be very difficult to get people to spend even 50 minutes doing an online survey without a great deal of prompting. So maybe thanks also to Andrew for necessary harassing people to get the thing back in. So that's really good. I'm really looking forward to the next stage of this, which is actually really getting down into the details of the survey. It's early days yet. We haven't had time really to do the analysis, partly because coinciding with the summer holidays. But in due course, hopefully by the end of September, we'll be able to ready with something a bit more substantive to say about that. So that's where we are with it, and I hope that makes it relatively clear about how what we've done here in Northern Ireland fits into the rest of the picture, the wider picture, in the rest of the UK. So thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Nick. That was, yes, thank you. That's very helpful. So Julianne, could you put up the breakout room questions for me, please? They're on the slide. So we're going to spend 20 minutes now in breakout rooms, and we're going to look at 3 specific questions. So you might want to note these down, because my experience of Zoom is that once you go into your breakout rooms, the questions disappear. So it's important just to have them in your head, although all the facilitators have them anyway. So the questions we're going to look at this morning are, what are your initial impressions about what you've heard to date? And were there any surprises, things that you didn't expect to hear? It would be interesting to talk a little bit about some of Laura's findings around some of the new things that might come forward in terms of more flexibility, the blended approach of volunteering, different things like that. Also be really interested to hear what people's perspective are on Ewen's findings in relation to our public policy context. And then we will take a little bit of time, if we have it, to think about how your organisations are currently involving volunteers and what the key challenges are. And again, if there are any extra support that you need at this stage. So without further ado, we're going to move into our breakout rooms. And then at the end of that time, we're going to come back and just do a short plenary, and everybody will have an opportunity to feedback. And then I'm going to just give you a bit of an overview of the next steps and when you'll... Okay, great. Very good. That all seemed to go much quicker than I thought it would. So we had a really very interesting conversation in my group, but I'm not going to hog the limelight by telling you all that first. I'm going to listen to what everybody else was saying. So I'm just going to go to facilitator from one of the other groups. So who would like to go first and give us a bit of feedback? George, do you want to go first?
I don't mind. We just got question 1 completed, and slightly on the question 2, so forgive us for that, but very good and thoughtful response. Overwhelmingly within the group, one of the key themes that everyone touched on was funding and investment, and very much about core costs. And we had 2 local authorities, and we had a statutory organisation there as well. One of the local authorities does fund core costs, the other local authority doesn't, and the statutory infrastructure organisation did as well. So quite interesting in terms of that being a real topic for moving forward. Looking at funding and investment, not only centrally but locally, and right down to grassroots. You know, a support organisation who have been working with volunteer-led organisations who are, some cases during the pandemic, were actually making use of their own resources to deliver services, and you know, that's not right, you know, in terms of that. Everyone agreed that yes, most definitely we need to take time to recuperate before we start talking about recovery. Everyone is tired, everyone is burnt out, and it is really time to reflect and sit back and think, let's recuperate here, and then let's begin to think about what recovery looks like. Couple of other things that come out, we were talking around the policy context and the difference between the 4 nations, but the 2 local authority representatives, very much about how their relationships with the community, that was a real positive through the pandemic. The community hubs began to be developed. It was even said that so much couldn't have actually been delivered unless they have those relationships. So relationships was a key thing when it came to delivering services throughout the pandemic. And just to summarise, if I've left anything out, guys, please do fill in. But question 2, we did get briefly a chat about it in terms of, are you currently involving volunteers? Most organisations were obviously about enabling. Local authorities, yes, they do involve volunteers, but because of the policy context in Northern Ireland, working towards public health guidance, all volunteers were stood down. And in terms of support organisations, very much about digital exclusion, and people within communities not having the digital format to be able to continue volunteering. And we didn't get to question 3, so I do apologise for that.
No, don't worry.
If I left anything out, everybody happy from my group in terms of the summary? Great. Okay.
Great.
Thank you, Denise.
Lovely. Okay. So who would like to go next in terms of providing some feedback from their group? Ewen, are you going next? Yeah, great. Lovely. Thank you.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We had an awful lot of overlap with what George said there, and you know, like really 100% almost, to be honest. I think one thing that really came out strongly, I mean, I sort of abused my position as chair and asked lots of questions that I wanted to know about, rather than maybe my group members would have something they wanted to add. But I think that it touches upon what Laura said earlier, the distinction between formal and informal, and I was really interested in how that related to the sort of the ongoing context with the Northern Irish Assembly, and both the others in the group sort of felt that the informal had to happen anyway, and it was just a case of a very pragmatic response and people cracking on because something had to happen. But it's interesting that became the place where it was possible for it to happen, and there wasn't really possible for a formal response or a more strategic policy level response to happen. So that was really interesting. But and in some sense the response as George was saying has strengthened that context and actually perhaps has, in the absence of policy, has actually developed an area that was perhaps in need of development, but without that sort of direct government oversight. So that's really fascinating in terms of and it touches on what Laura talked about this morning, that distinction between the formal and the informal, and maybe that distinction isn't actually that helpful. So I mean, maybe that's a question we need to think about in terms of what happens next. Is do we need to distinguish, and if we do, can we find ways to be able to distinguish which aren't just about, well, that's one type and that's another type?
Yeah, because mostly people move as well on a continuum. I don't know if you've seen Eden Project have just produced a piece of work on that, which I've fed into. I think that issue is people move. They might be formal one day, informal another day. In one organisation they're formal, in another context they're informal, and then sometimes they're both. And who cares anyway? Because they don't care. So I think we probably do need to unpack that a wee bit more and see if we can kind of make that more user friendly, I think, in the way we talk about it.
And I think, Denise, just touching on that, and sorry for coming in on that.
It's fine.
The word mutual.
Yeah.
The word mutual as a theme, you know, it is a softer word, and it is about community power. It is about community connection. And if we are delivering mutually together, there is no distinction then between the informal and the formal. And as you quite rightly say, some people are formal one day, informal the next. So the mutuality around that is maybe a softer way forward.
Yeah, it's interesting. Andrew, do you want to go next? Are you ready to go next? Thanks, Ewan.
So our group as well, we sort of just brushed on question 2. So most of our time was spent on question 1. It was good to hear from our group that it's useful info and it's timely as well. And it's good that it's given a perspective wider than a local community. So it's good to be able to compare with other nations. The sort of stuff coming back, there's no real surprises, but a bit of disappointment in that in terms of the policy stuff, that in Scotland in particular, they're in such a position where they have a good platform to be able to communicate with government as a voluntary community sector. We had Irene in our group as well, who was given that perspective from England and highlighted the same feelings of envy and disappointment as well. So when we are moving forward, it's probably useful to look at Scotland as opposed to then England or other examples as well. It was also mentioned in our group that the community planning stuff involving volunteers just before this was really kicking off, and it's important to try and reinvigorate that. So that's something that we should definitely look to take forward right across. Just into question 2, it was just communicated. A lot of it was, there was new rules, some were adopted, some became limited, and it was warming when they were able to get rules that were suitable, because it gave an opportunity to the volunteers to get out there and get involved again. So that came back clear. The reset is really going to be for service dependent, how the service is, whether it's safe, what the guidance is in relation to that. And I think generally that's still uncertain. So it is hard to see how we're going to come back. And then finally, the point on formal and informal, just reiterated again, that we should learn from it and not be too prescriptive. And that's formal, that's informal, and try and blend them in a way and learn what's best through the both of them. So if anyone in our group has anything else to add, feel free to jump in as well.
Okay, thanks very much, Andrew. And Laura, do you want to come next?
Yeah, thanks, Denise. I wish my handwriting was more legible, but I'll try and get through what I've got. Same as Andrew, there was no kind of real surprises in our group, but there was a sense of wanting to carry the momentum forward and not lose the goodwill that was observed during the pandemic, and to look at ways of how we support community groups and community activity. On the second question, we looked at people thinking about introducing volunteering in different formats, that kind of more informal, flexible offer. You don't have to come every week for 4 hours, you know, you might have 3 days a month that you can come, and that's okay, and that still counts. And And we talked about the Be Collective platform being invested in as a way to facilitate some of those opportunities. And then another theme that arose from our group was about digital formats not being for everyone. We talked about the context of telephone befriending for mental health and care leavers, and looking at some people don't want to engage with the telephone service, or it doesn't kind of provide that same level of experience. And then we ended on quite a bold, quite profound, bigger statement about how volunteering fits into kind of conversations about mental health more broadly, and how mental health services are configured. So we didn't try and tackle that in 15 minutes, but that's where we ended up.
Yeah, I think it's probably a bit beyond any of us in 15 minutes, that one. Yes, but we've just had a new mental health strategy launched for Northern Ireland, so I think there are opportunities to see those kinds of linkages. So in our group, we were similar things. So I think we did spend a bit of time at the beginning, just I suppose reflecting on how could we have done this better. I think it was kind of that learning from some of the things, Laura, you shared in your report, and I think Michaela said it really well, that we lost people and we lost time, and we didn't have the right people in the right place, and a connectivity that allowed people to be moved to the right place at the right time. So that lack of structure, did kind of lose time, albeit then what we saw was that the community just mobilized on its own. So I think there's reflection and learning. I think the discussion around that kind of emergency response was interesting, because Jürgen was reflecting on the fact that in Germany at the moment with the floods, the same phenomena are playing out in the sense where, you've got lots of people coming forward to help and no clear roles for them, and overlap and things being done. And, so 'twas ever thus, but part of me thinks, could we not learn from this and see if there's a better way of making a plan? And we talked about passporting and the new DCMS report that's just come out about volunteering passporting. So it's maybe worth thinking about that and reflecting on that as we sort of go ahead with this project and the report writing from it. But that idea that you can be passported once and then move around, and whether or not that can really solve this problem. But there's definitely an issue there in terms of how you manage that spontaneous outpouring of giving when something bad happens, and how that's kind of channeled into something useful for everybody. So that was a sort of a main discussion, I think, from our point of view. Big issue around broadband, lack of rural broadband, problems therefore from a policy point of view. There's not a clear enough policy about making sure everybody can be digitally active, and that's something. Also, we discussed the policy differences and the inconsistencies across the four nations, and particularly in relation to that emergency response setting in Northern Ireland, that civil contingencies piece, and the fact that our civil contingencies plans, legislation were quite old, and we maybe didn't have some of the structures that elsewhere in the UK were there. So that was something that we discussed. Also, the sports sector really feeling that a lot of their work was just shut down whenever the pandemic first started. And again, how do you mobilise those hundreds and hundreds of people to be able to do something useful in those kind of situations? And whether that just happens spontaneously, or is there a better way of doing that? So I think that was us. Anybody in my group want to say anything else, or did I pick up on everybody's points? Oh, and the last thing was just that business of exhaustion. I think that came through quite strongly in our discussion as well, and that feeling that people were just depleted and needed time to reflect, to draw a breath, and this feeling that it's actually not over. I mean, we're still living through this, we're still working through it every day. And I mean, I was thinking back, Irene, I was just thinking about when we filled in the form to make the application for this bid, and how we thought we were great because it was the beginning of the summer last year, we were rebuilding and all the rest of it. And then by the time we got the funding, we realized that actually we're in the middle of a second lockdown, and we had to skew everything again. And I still think we're in the middle of it's like being on a bucking bronco. You don't know which way it's going to go next, and I think that's where we are with it at the moment still. So that feeling of tiredness definitely came through in our group. So it's not a very cheery point to end on, but maybe it's a real point to end on for people. So anybody else from my group want to say anything else before we move on, just to wrap up? Well, Thanks very much, everybody, for taking part this morning. We will, as I say, we've recorded the session. We'll be putting it out on the website. Just actually, it's going to out in RV Connect today, and then it'll be live on our website as a link for the next few days, and we'll put it onto the main project website as well. So as you've heard today, we're at the very beginning of the survey analysis. That's going to be we're working on that to have that completed by the end of August. We're also then going forward with our interviews with policy stakeholders during August, so that by the end of August, all of the data collection aspect of the project will be completed. The conclusions, initial conclusions from the survey and from our discussions today and from Laura's and Ewen's work will guide our initial interviews with those policymakers. We're also doing a detailed analysis of the Be Collective data for Northern Ireland and the Team Kinetic data, which was another electronic matching platform which is used in England and Wales and in Scotland. So that data has been made available to the project as well, and that will be analysed over the next few months with a view then to pulling together a final report and a final project briefing by, well, our project will end at the end of October, but we will be doing our feedback briefing probably in line with our conference at the beginning of December. So we normally, we're hoping every 2 years to be doing a conference, and so we're looking at whether to do that face-to-face or online at the moment, but you'll hear more about that in the next month or so. Also, I would just draw your attention to the blogs and the podcasts which are available on the project website, particularly the Paused Volunteering podcast, which has quite a lot of Northern Irish voices. You'll recognise some of them whenever you listen to it, but it gives a really good overview of what's happened in some organisations and how organisations have dealt with it. The website address for the project is up on the slide. I'll send that out this morning after we've finished today. And I just wanted to say a big thank you to all of you for taking part this morning. Thank you for joining us and for your interest in the project. And I know many of you looking around the room are those who have filled in the form and completed our survey. And as Nick said, we couldn't do any of this work without you. So we really appreciate the time and effort that you've taken to be part of that. So without further ado, I want to say thanks for taking part. Go out and enjoy that lovely sunshine and have your lunch outside under a cool shady tree, and take care of yourselves, and we'll obviously see you again soon. Thank you very much.
Please.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.